Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bill Clifford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America. And today, day 2 of our WACA 2020 National Conference, New Frontiers in Diplomacy and National Security. This is the hour that we're presenting think tank briefings all week. It is a popular feature of our in-person conference, and this year, of course, we're doing it all via Zoom. We're delighted to bring you the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a relatively new think tank that was founded just under a year ago here in Washington, D.C. And there couldn't be a better time to feature our speakers today. So far, we have 2 out of the intended 3, and if Rachel Esplin Odell joins us, we will add her to the conversation. But as you've been following in the news, we had NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warn against premature troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, and several Republican senators doing the same. Also, we learned that the president and the administration had been considering military options for an attack on Iran. And so this brings us to a very good conversation opportunity with our speakers from Quincy Institute. First, I would like to introduce, and I got to go to my bio page, excuse me. Stephen Wertheim is a historian of the United States and the world. His writings appear regularly in mainstream periodicals as well as scholarly journals. In 2020, Prospect Magazine named him one of the world's top 50 thinkers for the COVID age. Stephen is Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quincy Institute. He's also a research scholar at Columbia, where he received his PhD with distinction. I want to note especially that his new book, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, came out just under a month ago. It examines the pursuit of military dominance by U.S. leaders. Trita Parsi, many of you know. He's spoken at dozens of councils over the years, and he is Executive Vice President at Quincy Institute. He's an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign politics, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He is an award-winning author of 3 books on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. The latest one is Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, published by Yale in 2017. It reveals the behind-the-scenes story to the historic nuclear deal with Iran. Trita was born in Iran and moved with his family to Sweden when he was 4 years old to escape political repression. He moved to the US as an adult and studied foreign policy at Johns Hopkins SAIS, where he received his PhD under Frank Fukuyama and Zbigniew Brzezinski. He's the co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. Stephen and Trita, welcome to the program. Maybe we'll get Rachel joining us soon.
Just saw that Rachel has joined.
She has joined because I am blind. So Rachel, hello. Good afternoon. I'm going to introduce you now. Rachel Odell is a research fellow at the East Asian program at Quincy and an expert in U.S. strategy towards Asia, Chinese foreign policy, and maritime disputes. She was an international security fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center last year into this year, and she received her PhD in political science from MIT. She's also served in the China Affairs Bureau of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office here in DC. Now, the trio from Quincy Institute, it's over to you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill, for your kind introduction, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today under the auspices of the World Affairs Councils of America. So I'm going to moderate this discussion and chime in as I like as well. The Quincy Institute, first of all, launched, it feels like a decade ago. It was less than a year ago at the beginning of December of last year. And Trita, you and I were 2 of the organization's 5 co-founders, and I will say you were the spearhead. So could you tell us, first of all, why you thought that a new institute was needed in a town that, let's be honest, has plenty of them?
You're quite right. There's no shortage of think tanks in Washington, D.C., but there is a significant difference. There is a massive shortage of think tanks in D.C. that are willing to question some of the first principles of American foreign policy. The impetus for creating the Quincy Institute was a recognition that we had essentially reached a degree of conceptual deficit in American foreign policy, in which we were essentially just spinning our wheels. We were not reaching new answers, just looking at old patterns and old theories of what needed to be done. Not a single one of the think tanks in DC were devoting themselves explicitly to reviewing some of the first principles of American foreign policy and considering alternatives to it. And more specifically here, we're talking about the belief that what really makes America safe is the idea of having global military hegemony, dominating the world militarily as the bedrock of American foreign policy. As long as that is the accepted principle of foreign policy, the accepted framework, the paradigm of American foreign policy, the variations within it will be very, very limited. And the type of changes that I think many increasingly are asking for cannot really come out of that paradigm. What we can get out of that paradigm, what we have seen that paradigm produce, is endless war. So if we are against endless war, if we believe that there needs to be a different way of approaching the world rather than engaging militarily all over the globe, then we have to be willing to question this paradigm and these first principles of American foreign policy. And we felt that there wasn't that willingness in Washington. There's plenty of really good think tanks. We have deep respect for them and their expertise. It's not about that. It's about the willingness to think outside of the box. And I think the last year or so has truly vindicated our argument that we do need to think outside of the box. I think you, Stephen, tweeted not long ago that we have roughly 9/11 level of American deaths every 3 days as a result of COVID. Yet it's been quite clear that $800 billion a year or more to the Pentagon has done absolutely nothing to protect us from a threat that is far greater than any of the military threats that we otherwise usually talk about. So where is that willingness to review and recognize that actually the greatest challenges that not only the United States, but the entire world right now face in this century are planetary threats, are threats such as pandemics, climate chaos. And in that context, why should we continue to have a foreign policy that puts a premium on military domination rather than the degree of human collaboration that is needed in order to be able to deal with climate chaos, pandemics, etc.? That's why I think it was imperative to have a different think tank in Washington to bring in those ideas into the conversation in DC.
So those ideas are first and foremost what makes the Quincy Institute distinctive. This is an organization in the heart of DC with opposition to endless war in its very mission statement. I want to drill down a little bit on the policy agenda for the rest of our discussion. But for now, I just want to highlight one other thing. Another unique aspect of the organization is its transpartisan approach. Can you tell us, I mean, lots of organizations are nonpartisan, as the Quincy Institute is, but it also self-identifies as transpartisan. Why take such an approach? What does that term mean? And why use it and take that transpartisan approach in an era of quite bitter partisanship?
You're quite right, Stephen. That is another feature that distinguishes us from the other think tanks. So let's first define what we mean by transpartisan. It is not bipartisan in the sense that there are two sides, they have strong disagreements, and then they agree on some form of a compromise in the middle that neither of them are really that particularly content with, but it's a compromise and they have to go with it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about transpartisan, which means that there are several different sides. They actually are not compromising. They're identifying the areas in the Venn diagram that they have overlap. Areas in which the left and the right actually agree on things without compromising, and trying to make sure that on those areas, we do as much collaboration as possible, regardless of the other disagreements that exist. So for instance, we have seen that some of the most important developments in Congress on foreign policy in the last 4 years have actually been on Yemen, in which Congress, both the House and the Senate, historically voted to end the American support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. That was a vote that came through as a result of transpartisanship. It were progressive lawmakers such as Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna, who have very little in common with some of the conservative partners that they partner up with, such as Rand Paul and Mike Lee from Utah. But they did agree on this issue, and they were willing to set aside their other differences in order to collaborate on these foreign policy issues. And they succeeded. It's frankly the only successes that we've seen in foreign policy have been as a result of transpartisanship. We thought that this is essential because the type of changes we're looking for are quite systemic. We're talking about paradigm shifts. A paradigm shift in American foreign policy is very unlikely to come about if it is only driven and if it's only championed by one specific party. There needs to be a coalition that transcends party lines in order to be able to bring about that deep level of thinking, change of thinking and paradigm shift in foreign policy that we believe is necessary in order to be able to end these endless wars and transform American foreign policy to one that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint.
All right, so let's turn to what we think American grand strategy ought to be in the 21st century. What, if we had our druthers, would the United States do in the world going forward? For my own part, I think it's really useful to not to take U.S. interests as they are, as they have been accumulated through decades of U.S. military engagement, through partnerships and alliances where countries have learned to depend on the United States and vice versa, but to think fresh. What are the interests of the American people internationally, given the unique environment that we face? So my own answer would be our foremost threats to the American people where they live and work would be, look around us, pandemic disease, climate change. These are issues that happen to be planetary and transnational, and so they require international action, cooperation, some competition too. But they are simply not going to be solved by, one country totally decarbonizing, which say wouldn't solve the problem of emissions of greenhouse gas emissions in China, the world's largest emitter. So we have to find a way to work together on those. What would not be high up on my list is the defense of the United States militarily, given that we've got a strong military and it should remain strong and potent. It should defend the United States against any kind of attack. We should maintain nuclear deterrence, which adds to the incredible unlikelihood that another state would attack the United States. But what we shouldn't do is continue to prioritize the maintenance of military dominance on a global scale, which I think in our own age has become an end unto itself. So the United States might well take part in counterbalancing coalitions if there are aggressive actors that are threatening to dominate an important region of the world. That debate certainly ought to be had. But we are not doing that. In fact, we're preventing counterbalancing coalitions from emerging by putting the United States out front in just about every theater that there is. And we would strenuously object if any other power acted the same way. We ought to look at how things appear when we switch the flags. So that's just a little bit of what I think. Let's get a little bit more granular. I'm going to go back to you, Trita, and then over to Rachel. So Trita, talk about what a grand strategy of diplomatic engagement and military restraint would look like in the Middle East if you had your druthers.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the first thing we have to recognize that even though we don't explicitly state that this is our policy, reality is our policy is to seek to dominate the Middle East militarily. We have 58,000 troops there now. We have more than 19 bases in the region, and they're scattered around in order to be able to dominate it. And the conventional thinking in Washington is that if we're not there, if we're not dominating, the region will transcend into chaos. And as a result, we have no choice but to keep this level of military dominance in the region. Reality is, however, quite different. If you just take a look at the track record of what has happened under Pax Americana in the last 25 or so years, it is actually dramatically getting worse. We had 5 armed conflicts in the Middle East in 1998. By 2019, those had mushroomed into 22 armed conflicts. And I think it's been 1 or 2 even added to that since then. That is clearly not all the fault of the United States, but as the hegemon, it is its responsibility. And so I think it's quite clear we have not been able to maintain that degree of stability that we claim that we're there to uphold. But if we take a look at it one step deeper, you actually see that that domination has actually disincentivized certain countries, strategic partners of the United States, from pursuing diplomatic solutions and engagement with their neighbors, because it's simply more advantageous for them to simply live under the security umbrella of the United States, have the United States outpower and outarm and outmaneuver their rivals at the expense of the US itself, without them having to engage in that messy process of compromising with their neighbors. It has led to them becoming even more reckless, because whenever they are reckless and create problems, we're there with it by the snap of the finger to bail them out. I'm specifically thinking right now of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It's actually quite fascinating to see that there have been plenty of opportunities for diplomacy between Iran and Saudi Arabia, 2 major powers in the region that absolutely need to talk to each other if we're ever going to have some degree of stability in the region. There's been plenty of feelers coming out of Tehran. The Saudis felt weak because they were losing in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and they were hiding behind American power. So I can understand why they were disinclined to engage, because they were not in a strong position. But if that umbrella did not exist, they would be forced to find ways of engaging with the Iranians. And there were a few moments in which we actually saw that happening. When there were conflict almost between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we saw that the Iranians were most likely behind the attacks on Saudi oil fields, most likely behind some of the tanker that exploded, which seemed to have been a response to the US seeking to completely blockade the country and preventing it from selling oil. We saw that Donald Trump actually did not move forward to defend the Saudis, and he was quite clear that it didn't seem to make a lot of political sense for him to get himself into a war in order to defend Saudi Arabia against Iran. At that moment, suddenly, the Saudis and the UAE started their own diplomacy with Iran quietly behind the scenes. That all ended once the United States stepped back into the scene and assassinated Iranian General Soleimani. And we're now back to square one, in which the Saudis and the UAE feel that it's much more advantageous for them to push the United States to be confrontational with Iran, not pursue its own diplomacy, which then also allows them not to engage in that type of compromise. So we're seeing that the dominance of the United States has actually become an obstacle for the region evolving into its own diplomacy and finding its own solutions to their own problems. So instead of preventing chaos, we are unfortunately preventing solutions.
Well, I find that incredibly compelling. I work here after all. But let me ask the same question to Rachel about a very different region, different set of challenges, and that is East Asia. The rise of China has emerged as probably the most significant challenge for the United States to address. It's a long-term challenge. Of course, the United States has pursued a more hawkish line toward China, even as it has only intensified, certainly not reduced, its military role in the Middle East. So thinking about the challenge, all the complex challenges that China's rise throws up, what kind of overall strategy would you like to see the United States pursue toward China in the medium term?
Thanks, Stephen. I think that the starting point for U.S. strategy towards China and towards Asia, of course, needs to be what are U.S. interests in the region. And as you mentioned towards the beginning of the call, the most important, U.S. interests of Americans are in securing them from things like pandemic disease and climate change. And this region, and China in particular, is critical to that end. And so, we really need to sort of shift the priorities. Sometimes a lot of people in Washington acknowledge that there needs to be a balance of competition and cooperation, but too much in recent years, we've really shifted towards the competition side and even the adversarial, in an adversarial direction, in a way that is really undermining any of that essential cooperation that we need. So first, it's leading out and cooperating with China, being much bolder in pursuing joint climate change initiatives. We're the two largest carbon emitters by far, and in managing pandemics better. This is something that in the last few years, the Trump administration has removed a lot of our health experts that were on the ground in China to monitor things like pandemic outbreaks. These have been established on a bipartisan basis over the last couple of decades. That's the kind of thing that we need to rebuild. We would have had better, situational awareness during this outbreak if that had been the case, if we'd still had those there. So we need to rebuild that kind of cooperation, but also expand it much further. But then, of course, there is the competitive aspect to the relationship. There are things about China's rise that are challenging. But the problem is even in the way the United States has approached the competition with China, we've done it in ways that are actually self-undermining. So not only are we leaving aside the essential cooperation that we need, we're not even competing effectively. And in order to compete effectively, I'd say there's three things that the United States really needs to do differently. The first and foremost is we need to realize that the challenge China poses is not primarily military in nature. It is more about economics and values and how we want to structure our society. And even in that regard, China's not actively trying to tear down democracies around the world, but it does set a certain model that could impede could be attractive to other countries, a more sort of authoritarian status model. So what's the best way to compete against that? It's to provide a better alternative model. And so really, this points to the imperative of getting our own domestic house in order, and of instead of prioritizing military solutions to China's rise, to prioritize economic revitalization, economic investment and engagement in Asia and around the world. And then the second thing we need to do is realize that a lot of a lot of the competition over norms and values in the international system today is taking place in international institutions, many of which we've abandoned. And this isn't just a Trump administration era problem. There's been a lot of ways in which we have sort of let our influence in international institutions atrophy over the years. And some of this has to do with the failure of the United States to get our own sort of norms and regarding things like artificial intelligence and data privacy really in order. And so some of that needs to start at a domestic level first, where we haven't really resolved how we're going to approach these issues as a society. So we need to do that, and then we need to be advocates for those norms at an international level. Otherwise, China will fill that vacuum, and countries will sort of go towards a more Chinese model that is not always in line with our democratic values. And then I think the third piece of this more effective competition is to shift our military strategy, so it's not as dominance oriented. Trita was discussing the ways in which we seek dominance in the Middle East, and we do this in Asia as well. And so while we may need to maintain some military presence in Asia, that really could be structured in a much more defensive fashion, where we're, instead of trying to maintain dominance or control over all of the airspace and sea space right up to China's border, we instead are seeking to deny China the ability to harm our allies or other countries in the region. And as part of this, of course, as you mentioned earlier, Stephen, the allies need to be doing much more than they are currently, so that we're playing more of a supporting role to their defense.
All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about what we would like American foreign policy to look like, let's talk about the next 4 years. The Quincy Institute is, after all, not just a think tank, but I hate this phrase, an action tank, but it's true. We are here to make a difference, not to put forward great ideas that don't go anywhere. So, Trita, what realistic opportunities are you looking at for the Biden administration, for Congress, et cetera, to make concrete progress on Middle East policy over the next 4 years?
Stephen, you just used another term that I hate, which is realistic options. That's oftentimes a term that is used to make sure that we actually don't make any changes and that we stick to a suffocating status quo. I think part of the action type element of QI is to make sure that options that previously were unthinkable to not only become thinkable, but become viable because it's needed. I hope, although I can't claim to have a tremendous amount of optimism, that the Biden administration realizes that they have an opportunity to really profoundly review and change some of the policies of the United States. I think if they stick to that type of a formula of marginal changes and they don't do anything when it comes to the global military posture, I think it will be a major opportunity that will be lost. But within the things that they themselves see as realistic, clearly they're looking at what can be done to revive the Iran nuclear deal. And the Biden administration has stated quite clearly that they would like to go back to what they call a compliance for compliance solution, which means that the United States complies with the JCPOA and the Iranians go back into full compliance. I think that is critical. I think it's also very positive that they've sent signals that after that, they would like to engage in a broader negotiation to address other issues. I think that's also very important. A couple of challenges that they will have, though. The Iranians are having their elections in June of next year. That means that between inauguration and sometime in May, whatever happens on the JCPOA will likely have to happen during that time period, because there's a significant likelihood that the Iranians will have a rather conservative president after June, and quite likely that that person will not only have run on a platform opposing the JCPOA, just as the Republicans did here in the United States in 2016, but also potentially on a platform opposing the very idea of engagement with the United States, mindful of the very bitter experience that they have had with the JCPOA when the United States breached that agreement. So I think it's critical to make sure that something happens during that time period. My fear, though, is that it won't be enough. I've argued recently in Foreign Affairs that if you truly want to make sure that the JCPOA becomes durable, which means that it's not going to be at the mercy of whoever becomes president, but it will have some degree of institutional support and insulation around it that doesn't make it so sensitive to political winds in Tehran or in Washington, then we need to do something to actually improve the broader relationship between the United States and Iran. We cannot have the expectation that a major arms control agreement can survive if the two countries, the two principal countries of that agreement, continue to be at each other's throats. That will require political will. It will require political and diplomatic finesse. I know that the Biden team does have that finesse. It's largely the same team that got the JCPOA. Whether the political will exists or not is a different story.
All right, thank you. I want to remind everyone that it would be a great time now to start putting your questions in the chat. I see that several are there already. Thank you for that. And we're just about to open things up to address those questions. But just to give you a little bit more time and to hear about opportunities and risks in the near term with respect to China and the East Asia region, I want to turn to Rachel. What do you think can be achieved? Yeah, realistic, but maybe pushing the envelope, as Trita suggests that we should. And what worries you the most over the course of the next 4 years?
So I think the most promising progress that can be made in the short term, honestly, is reversing some of the damaging moves that the Trump administration has taken vis-a-vis China. In particular, they've basically suspended all bilateral dialogue, except for very occasional, a few sort of mill dialogues that have taken place, and that those have really attributed the last few years. So restoring a lot of those dialogues to address many of the things that we've already discussed: climate change, pandemics, reopening and expanding the CDC office again in Beijing, and NIH office and NSF staff. So a lot of the scientific collaborations that have been cut off can be reestablished and restored. There are likely going to be some opportunities to rethink the approach to the trade war, sort of back away from some of the most counterproductive, self-defeating tariffs that we've imposed on China, and think about what's a better way forward on trade relations with China. And this won't be going back to the status quo ante, but it will be a less sort of self-harming form of approach to the trade relationship. And I think there's also potential for enhanced crisis management mechanisms and dialogues at the military level. This is something where there has been some progress made during the Trump administration, and just recently, Secretary Esper met with counterparts and spoke with counterparts in China, and they're making progress in that regard. But there's and this is something that Michelle Flournoy, who's likely to be the next Secretary of Defense, has also signaled her support for. And so there's some room there for the United States and China to better coordinate to make sure that at a crisis like an accident at sea between US and Chinese Navy ships doesn't escalate into broader war. So I think those are some areas for real progress, but none of these represent the sort of more fundamental shifts that I recommended earlier. And I think that this is, if we're looking at what we realistically have over the next 4 years, I think two things that I would hope that the administration could stretch for. One is a much bolder approach to US-China climate cooperation. One that, at the Paris Accord was really successful in large part due to cooperation between the United States and China. But Paris was not nearly enough for what the world needs to really tackle the challenges posed by climate. So we need something to follow up on Paris. And some of that may need to take place at an international level, but I think there also could be room for real bilateral cooperation that is not just about international agreement, but is about sort of joint economic investments in deep decarbonization technology and development aid for developing countries to ensure that they're able to develop in a more sustainable way than we did and that China did. And so, that would be one where clearly we have shared interests. This is a priority of the Biden administration. And recently, Xi Jinping declared that China intends to become carbon neutral by 2060. So, this is a priority of the respective administrations, and I hope that they can push forward on that. And then I think the other key area, and where I think the verdict is still out as to whether the Biden administration will move in this direction, is to really change our military strategy in the region and recognize that the trend that we're on, the trajectory we're on, is not sustainable and is quite destabilizing, and that it really doesn't serve U.S. interests, and to instead shift to a more cost-effective, denial-oriented strategy. Some of these strategies are floating around out there, but it's not clear that the political will yet exists to pursue them. But certainly, I hope that in the budgeting conversations that this administration leads, that we can move more in that direction.
Terrific. Let me turn things over to Bill, who will moderate our audience questions.
Thank you all so much for engaging in this conversation. I want to let our viewers know that they can continue to pose questions via the chat, and those centering on East Asia will be directed to Rachel, those for the Middle East to Trita, for Europe to Stephen, and we'll take global issues and other regional conundrums for those of the three who wish to answer them. So from Howard Snyder on the West Coast, this is for Rachel, a follow-up to what you were suggesting about how the US can encourage China's peaceful rise. Does that include drawing down our massive military presence in Japan and Korea and the 7th Fleet? And what would that, if it were to happen, signal to our allies there?
Yes, so as I alluded to earlier, I think that one thing we have to realize with China is that although there are some aspects of China's rise that present challenges to the United States, it's not primarily a military challenge. Obviously, China is not poised to be able to, present a threat to the United States homeland. Of course, it possesses nuclear weapons, but at sort of orders of magnitude less than we have. And it certainly doesn't have any sort of capacity to really invade or otherwise harm the United States directly. Of course, it's a slightly different question for allies, but even there, China is not developing the capacity to sort of engage in regional conquest, military conquest. So this is something where, there are potential flashpoints. There are, of course, countries, our allies in Asia have legitimate concerns about, Chinese military modernization and growth. And, there's, of course, even short of the level of war, there's ways that China can use its military power to coerce other countries in some of the disputes that it still has with these nations. So it's understandable that these countries need the ability to, defend themselves. But the problem is as Trita alluded to earlier, our massive presence in Japan and Korea, especially in Japan, has really led to gaps in Japan's own capabilities. And some of this has to do with the history of Japan's peace constitution, but it's inextricably interconnected with the US alliance. And this is something where, we really don't need to have such a large ground presence in Japan anymore, ground troop presence. And there's still going to be room for other forms of military presence or collaboration with Japan, but there are ways in which, China's not going to invade Japan, with land forces. And so this is not, we don't need tens of thousands of Marines or Army troops in Japan. And that's the kind of thing that we could draw down. And Korea is a slightly different story. I think there really the key is to sort of reboot the diplomatic negotiations with Korea in a way that diffuses tensions, moves the North and South Korea closer towards a peace agreement, towards an end of the Korean War, recognizing that denuclearization will be a gradual thing. It's not going to happen immediately. And so, in that context, over time, we can draw down our true presence in Korea. But Korea has been doing more to invest in their own defense. And this is the direction the Moon government's hoping to move in. So I think there's real potential there. And I would hope the Biden administration would pick up on some of the constructive things the Trump administration has done in this regard and move that ball forward. And then that would open up opportunities for us to reduce our presence in Korea as well.
Excellent, thank you. This might be, Trita, for you, given your experience working with the Hill. From the Montana World Affairs Council, we have a question. What is the value proposition to American political parties beholden to electoral constituencies to compromise for transpartisanship at a time when compromise is seen as an existential threat?
Thank you so much. That's actually the beauty of it, that transpartisanship would not be a compromise. That's the entire point of transpartisanship. You have elements on the left, on the progressive side, that want to have a far less militarized foreign policy. You have elements on the right, libertarians and others, who are deeply tired of not only the endless wars, but what they view that has done to civil liberties inside of the United States itself. As a small parenthesis, we are named the Quincy Institute after John Quincy Adams, who in his speech in 1821 warned the United States that the United States is not a country that goes abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And if she were to do so, she could become the dictatress of the world, but it would come at the expense of her own liberty and her own spirit. And that, I think, is something a lot of libertarians see having happened as a result of 20 years of war on terror. So the idea here is to be able to work across the aisles without that compromise, because there actually are areas of agreement. We just want to capitalize on that and make sure that instead of that collaboration being episodic and happening every once in a while, to make sure that there's an institutional support for it so that we can have much more of that collaboration than we're currently seeing. And hopefully, a side effect of that will be that there will be less partisanship in general.
Great. This is a question from Ed Martins of World Boston. And I'll leave it with you, Stephen. And perhaps you can give both an American and a European perspective on it. Isn't it time for a Vietnam solution in Afghanistan, Vietnam, to declare victory and leave? They've had a few elections, let them sort it out. How does our staying help?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. I don't think our staying helps. I'm not sure that we can declare victory exactly. We should have declared victory very soon after we accomplished the original mission in Afghanistan of decimating al-Qaeda, who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks, and punishing the Taliban for harboring al-Qaeda. That was accomplished quite quickly. The mission then shifted into a nation-building mission that, we have to admit, hasn't succeeded and isn't going to succeed, especially with the number of troops that we have there. But with any troop, the surge did not work. It is simply not going to succeed. So whether you want to call it a success or a failure, the important thing is that we need to understand that actually we have achieved some of the key goals that we set out to do in Afghanistan. Other goals were not worthy of sending our men and women to die in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, those are not going to be fulfilled, and it is time to leave. It is simply time to leave. And unfortunately, the comparison with Vietnam may be apt. It may prove very difficult to have a good peace settlement in the country. When you lose a war, you can't expect that what you leave behind is going to look like it would have looked like if you had won the war. And a lot of people in Washington don't seem to understand this. They say, well, what about negative consequences if the United States leaves? Well, we aren't winning and nobody has a plan to win. So we have to do what is best for our people and in the long-term interest of Afghanistan. And we do need to put the war to an end. I think we all understand that the United States and the world have bigger priorities right now, but it is absolutely crucial. It's not just crucial for the US role in Afghanistan. Frankly, we have a big problem in our own country in which a lot of the public, and I don't probably need to tell you this, Bill, they're so cynical about American foreign policy and the people who make American foreign policy.
To that
I
point,
don't believe we can achieve any of our goals. And I think it is so important to establish credibility and legitimacy for what we're doing to be able to put these endless wars to an end.
To that point right there about the cynicism and really the establishment, I think that even current military leaders and former ones that sit along Massachusetts Avenue think tanks who are favorable to the Biden administration's approach probably are reluctant to leave too, are probably still reluctant to a troop drawdown in Afghanistan, or at least the speed at which maybe Trump had suggested this week. What do you think about the Biden administration's approach is likely to be? Overly cautious vis-a-vis Afghanistan and what your objectives at Quincy are?
Well, U.S. troops, according to the U.S. Taliban deal, are supposed to fully withdraw from Afghanistan as of the end of April this year. And that's what I want to see happen. If they can be withdrawn sooner, I think that would be a good thing. And the reason is precisely what you mentioned, is that so far what has come out of the Biden campaign has suggested that the United States would leave behind a residual presence to frankly carry out operations that can be done from a distance. And I think, as you alluded to, sunk costs are a very powerful thing. And it means it's not just a mental construct for people. It's individuals, institutions that have invested a lot and have experiences that they've built up in a place. And I understand that. But, once the United States leaves Afghanistan, what we really should do is assess the threat of terrorism from Afghanistan, just as we assess the threat globally, without inflating it, without treating Afghanistan differently from other places. And I fear that without a full withdrawal, we'll never be able to get to that place where we can escape the logic of sunk costs that has caused the war to go on for so long, even as military leaders and civilian leaders have thought for a great deal of time that our objectives were simply not achievable.
Bill, could I add a small parenthesis to this?
Please do.
Not surprisingly, I very much agree with Stephen on this. I do want to point out a phenomenon that we're dealing with here that I really hope the members of the World Affairs Council also think about a little bit. Every time there's talk of any type of troop withdrawal, it is major news. It creates all kinds of crisis. People in the administration throw tantrums and resign if they disagree with it. And it's really perceived and presented as some sort of abdication of responsibility, admission of defeat, all of these different kind of things. When the United States withdraws from diplomatic processes, there's hardly a peep about it anywhere. Certainly no one is resigning. I've never seen any anchor on TV throw a tantrum about it or even having a segment about it. Take what happened in the early months of the Trump administration. The United States withdrew from the Geneva process, which was bringing all of the different parties together over Syria and trying to find a political solution. The Obama administration had even managed to get the Saudis and the Iranians to come. Didn't mean that there was a solution that was close at hand, but it meant that finally all of the key elements were there. And if we just had a little bit more political will, it could have led to a solution 4 years ago and spared the Syrian people much, much suffering. The Trump administration withdrew, and soon thereafter the Europeans did. And that process essentially morphed into what is now called the Astana process, which is led by Russia, Turkey, Iran, and the Syrians. And the US is completely absent. So when we talk about military withdrawals, leaving vacuums and others coming, taking the place, I just wish there was a little bit more concern, perhaps even parity, when it comes to America withdrawing diplomatically, particularly if we're claiming that our military presence is there because we are so adamant about creating stability in those regions and we want to avoid chaos and suffering. Well, then we should use that same metric when it comes to our absence on the diplomatic side of things as well.
Rachel, what do you think about that? The United States essentially withdrew from a diplomatic/economic Trans-Pacific partnership with the Asia-Pacific region. And over the weekend, China inked a trade agreement with 14 East Asian powers. And that seems to have filled a vacuum and been regarded as a win for China diplomatically. And it certainly will enhance their resource power, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So this gets to the point that I was making earlier about how if we really want to compete effectively, then we need to completely change the balance of the tools that we're using to do so. And one of the main ways that would enable us to compete more effectively is through enhancing our economic relationships with countries in the region, including through things like the TPP. Now, of course, those kinds of arrangements, one of the beauties of them is that they're not zero sum, and it's not only about competition. It's also about, finding comparative advantages and, lifting all of our boats through trade. Now, the problem, of course, the reason why we have sort of lost that political will to remain engaged in the TPP process is that there are people in America suffering, and one of the economically, and one of the contributors to that over time has been free trade. It's not by far not the most significant contributor. Just automation and economic change more generally has driven a lot of these changes in our sort of manufacturing base. But there are certainly ways in which American elites in Washington have not done enough to help people adjust to the chaos or to the dislocations and the what sometimes is euphemistically called creative destruction that comes along with trade. And so, that failure to really provide those kinds of forms of adjustment and really reinvest the gains from trade in education and in infrastructure, that failure to do so has really weakened the political will to support trade agreements like TPP, which are very important economically, but are also important geopolitically. And so right now, it doesn't seem particularly likely that we're going to be rushing back into the TPP, or what's now called the CPTPP. It went forward without us, and as you said, I mean, in part due to countries like Japan stepping up and pushing for the agreement. And now there's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP agreement. So trade is moving forward without us. So we're disadvantaged there. But I think that the key, almost the key that we need before we can re-engage with those is to really think about how we're redistributing those gains from trade at home. And so that it's a really complex challenge. And I think this is one that traditionally foreign policymakers in Washington haven't grappled with sufficiently. But there are some signs actually that the Biden administration recognizes that. Jake Sullivan has written about this, about the need to really invest in our sort of economic resources at home in order to build some of that support for trade and for trade agreements like TPP. And so, one interesting thing too is that, the one thing the Trump administration did is renegotiate NAFTA. Now it's the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, and there weren't dramatic changes, but a few of the changes that were made to that agreement were actually also changes that were made to TPP after the U.S. left TPP. So now it's CPTPP, and basically it was sort of changing some of the investor-state dispute settlement provisions. and things that traditionally the U.S. has really pushed for, but the Trump administration's trade negotiators didn't like, and neither did a lot of other countries. And so there's actually a possibility, USMCA, this new NAFTA, had a lot of bipartisan support. So, it's theoretically possible that maybe we could rejoin this new TPP because it's kind of more in that vein. But I think there's sort of a bigger problem that needs to be grappled with in terms of how we're sort of providing economic investments at home.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with you, Rachel, because we have a question from Ken First, World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts. Please give us a briefing on Taiwan. We could have a whole session about how that relates to the U.S.-China negotiations. Is it a sore point for China and a point of standing? It is a sore point of China and a point of standing up to commitments for the United States.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is the giant asterisk next to my statement that I've made earlier that, the challenge posed to the United States is not primarily militarily, the challenge China poses. Clearly, the most likely source of military conflict between the United States and China would be a conflict over Taiwan. Taiwan is not a formal U.S. military ally. However, when we shifted our diplomatic recognition from the Republic of China government of Taiwan to the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, we also, at the same time, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which sort of ensures the United States has some level of commitment to providing defensive weaponry to Taiwan, et cetera. And so this is, whereas from China's perspective, Taiwan is a breakaway province. This is an unresolved civil war, and reunification is really viewed as the sort of core center of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy and its ability to sort of maintain control over what it perceives as sort of rest of periphery. And so there's a real sort of mismatch in interests in this regard. And Taiwan itself, has a say as it's a country, a sort of untraditional country of 24 million people. Untraditional in the sense that it doesn't have recognition in most international fora. And so this is an area where in recent years, the United States has been moving, I think, in a really dangerous direction. And at the same time that the developments in China are also moving the cross-strait dynamic in a more unstable direction. So the Trump administration has been not only selling weaponry to Taiwan, but also engaging in a lot of diplomatic and political signaling, high-level meetings that are sort of increasingly treating Taiwan like a nation in a way that violates the one China policy that we've long adhered to, where we only sort of recognize the PRC as the sole government of China. And so that's really changing the dynamic. Whereas in China, this is tied up to some extent with the Hong Kong situation, where China has really cracked down on Hong Kong's autonomy, and that's really soured public opinion in Taiwan, because oftentimes there's the concept of one country, two systems, that China and Hong Kong could be part of one country, but they'd have two different political systems. But a lot of people in Taiwan are watching what Beijing has done in Hong Kong and saying, if that's what one country, two systems is, then we don't trust that. So it's really weakening any support for eventual unification between Taiwan and China. And so that's, of course, contributed and has led to the sort of re-election of more pro-independence leaning political forces in Taiwan, which then China responds to with military exercises. So there really are some negative dynamics there. And I think the most important thing for the US to do moving forward is to stop pushing the relationship in the direction that it's heading, and instead sort of return back to the long-standing principles that have kept stability in the relationship, of the one China policy, and sort of not being ambiguous about whether or not we'd use force in a Taiwan scenario, because it would depend on what precipitated it. And I think I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will sort of stop the negative direction that we've been traversing recently.
Thank you. Before I come to you, Trita, and we've got about 5 minutes left to go. Stephen, I want to ask you a follow-up on this Taiwan question, because in the context of maybe your book, Tomorrow the World, the Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, if this kind of potential crisis were in the 20th century, you could, or even now, you could see it as the opening of a world war. And so if China feels empowered that the United States is in withdrawal mode, and just moves on Taiwan, do we just roll up and let it happen? Or what does that say to anybody else who's expecting US commitments to be held? Are we frozen?
Yeah,
I think
heard that.
Stephen is frozen, yeah.
Stephen is frozen. Okay, while we unfreeze Stephen somehow, then Trita, for you, this is a question from Alan. Americans have long had an isolationist streak, and since Reagan, international organizations have been demonized. So how do you see Biden's team getting 70 million voters to care about far-off countries or boring diplomacy?
I want to give Stephen the opportunity to answer that question, mindful of the fact that he just wrote an excellent book about this idea of isolationism. So Stephen, if you don't mind.
Sure. I apologize that my internet cut out earlier. Look, the fact is that isolationism has never existed in the United States. This is a term nobody thought to use ever in American history until the 1930s. And from that point onward, it's been used by one set of people who advocated more military force to impugn the other set of people who almost uniformly have said that there's no such thing. So we have to get it out of our minds that there's some kind of, powerful history of isolationism where Americans want nothing to do with the outside world. That's good news, I think. It's not all good news, because what we really face might be damaging in different ways, like nativism or militarism. Those things I think are more relevant to our current experience, or our very recent experience, than is something like isolationism, given that the Trump administration, for example, has claimed from the beginning that the US military was weak and needed to be rebuilt, and has spent more and more on the US military in the pursuit of, in its words, unquestioned military dominance. Does that sound like isolationism? So I think the problem is not that Americans don't like diplomacy or don't care about the world or America's role in the world. The problem is that they are scared because the pursuit of dominance militarily has accumulated a lot of enemies for the United States. People who resent US actions, who fight back, who go too far, attack us, we attack them, etc. The problem that people have with diplomacy is that they think it's weak, and they think we have real enemies out there and we got to go get them. And diplomacy is just a bunch of people in suits who can't get things done. And I get that concern. So what we need to do is have a more rigorous assessment of our vital interests. That is what will remove some of the inflated threats that people face and make them more comfortable with doing something that's a lot cheaper than using force, which is sending in diplomats to be peacemakers and resolve conflicts.
Let me reframe. Would Taiwan be a vital interest to protect, as opposed to going to war, to go to war for?
So that's not the specific case of Taiwan. That's not U.S. policy. Longstanding U.S. policy is to maintain strategic ambiguity because we want to assess what happens. What we should be doing, we should really want to avoid a situation where the United States and China fight World War III, period, and also fight it over the issue of Taiwan, where China's interests outstrips the US interests. We should really want to avoid this situation. What is happening in Washington is a desire to do the reverse. There's now discussion that the United States should abandon strategic ambiguity in favor of making a formal guarantee to defend Taiwan. I think that will be destabilizing.
Likely to produce more opportunity for war and conflict.
Produce more opportunity for war, but also make it more likely that the United States and China end up in World War III. I don't think we want that. We should look for every possible way to make sure Taiwan can defend itself including by providing defensive-oriented weapons, as Rachel mentioned earlier, and for seeing that capable US partners and allies in the region who ought to be more concerned with the potential for Chinese aggression as it continues to rise, to take more responsibility so it's not the United States putting itself in the lead and creating the potential for World War III.
Great.
If I could get 1 second in there, 1 second in there, just.
Okay.
I think it's also very important, particularly in the context of Taiwan, for people to ask those who are advocating moving away from the strategic ambiguity as to why that issue and World War III with China is more important and more valuable than preventing climate chaos, because they can't have it both ways. You cannot be able to have any chance of succeeding dealing with climate chaos if at the same time we are rushing into a Cold War or a World War III with China. And that is a question they need to answer, in my view.
That's very good. And so let's close by sort of circling back to the very beginning. Several of you have said that the climate risk is paramount. We heard that yesterday also from John Allen at Brookings. So I'm going to sort of reframe, Trita, the question, which all of you can answer from Allen, which is, never mind the isolationist streak, but that international organizations and multilateralism has been given a very bad rap lately through America First, and maybe generally there is a streak in U.S. foreign policy. Stephen has written about the League of Nations in a prize-winning earlier effort. So how much money can be moved out of defense and into a climate project? And how can we do this within a multilateral framework?
Stephen or Rachel, you guys want to take that?
Yeah, I can dive in a little bit. So I've been sort of working on analyzing this question of defense budget cuts and how we can restructure the military. And the fact is that there's a lot of room for cuts. I mean, I think 10% is a number that's been thrown around, and I think that's eminently achievable if they're sort of rationally, if those cuts are done in a rational way. Reducing army end strength is a way that to really achieve dramatic savings, and we really don't need to have nearly as large of an army as we have right now. There's a consensus in the political community that in the Washington community that we're not going to be getting into new nation building wars, and of course that's driven by shifts in American sentiment. There's problems with getting out of the wars that we're still in, as we've alluded to earlier, but I think there's a growing sense that this is not something the United States is going to be needing to do going forward. And even if we decided that we needed to get in some sort of ground conflict, we could build the army back up. So anyway, that's one major area we can make savings, but there's also a lot of long-term major legacy systems or really expensive platforms like the F-35 or large aircraft carriers, where we could reduce our spending on those and really save a lot as well. And some of the things we were talking about earlier, where we could be reducing our presence abroad, and not just to bring those troops home. People often make the point that in Germany and Japan, there's a lot of host nation support, and so it would actually be more expensive to bring them home. But our point would be, no, you could actually use that to reduce troop sizes in active duty. And so there's a lot of ways you can really achieve significant savings. And of course, by reducing our overseas contingency operation budget, by reducing the wars that we're fighting, and then think in those big terms and the kind of the large quantities that we invest in defense, and think of what we could accomplish with that if we invested that in research and development and clean energy, or in joint R&D efforts with Chinese companies that are really developing quickly in solar technology and other green climate technologies. And then thinking about how we could deploy those in developing nations around the world through aid and through loans and through investments that would enable people around the world to develop in ways that are much less carbon intensive. So I think that there's really a lot of room for that. And in fact, that's the key. That's why we need to exercise military restraint, is precisely so we can engage in those kind of investments.
Because of time, I'll wrap up in thanking this panel. Stephen, if you have closing words, maybe you can talk about one person you've convened on that subject, or what's up next for Quincy Institute. I want to have our network of World Affairs Councils really understand that quincyinstitute.org is a resource. Stephen has a book. We'd like to convene you, but maybe there are people that you've convened recently on the topic of climate or others that you would like to flag for us.
Actually, we did a symposium on greening U.S.-China relations. That's on our website, quincyinst.org. Go to reports and you'll see it. And so that doesn't just provide one person, that provides, I believe it's 7 essays on what would U.S.-China relations look like if we actually put the issue of climate change at the top of our agenda. But I just want to react finally to the last question as well. There's an enormous amount of savings we can get from lowering U.S. military spending, just by 10% with the grand strategy we have. But we can get a lot more by changing our grand strategy. And we should change our grand strategy and make it much more limited in a military sense. And the reason we should do so isn't so we can, obtain cost savings fundamentally. I mean, if it was really necessary to American security to keep us safe, then I would say, yeah, let's try and spend the money. It's not only is it not necessary to American security, the pursuit of armed primacy makes us less safe. It brings enemies upon us. It creates fear that wreaks havoc with our own democracy. And we see the results of that. And it creates endless war. And those wars, we're still trying to bring them to an end. And it's uncertain where that's going to go. That's the problem. So I'm not making, a kind of trade-off argument. Oh boy, it would be nice to be able to spend this much in the military, but we've got other things too. It is not nice to spend this much on the military. It makes us less safe. We can obtain more security at less cost.
Stephen Wertheim, Trita, Parsi, Rachel Odell. Just to quote John Quincy Adams, I'm sure this is on your website somewhere. America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She's a well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. I know you three are committed to enshrining that view, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future and at World Affairs Councils around the country. Thanks so much for joining us for this briefing. To my colleagues, many of you know who are council leaders and staff, we have a professional workshop on shaping diverse, equitable, and inclusive World Affairs Councils at 4 o'clock and at 7 p.m. Our next keynote will be with Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, he of the impeachment trial, and with a new book himself, Here Right Matters. Thank you again to the panel. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Bill Clifford for the World Affairs